Well, hello everybody, this is Tim Green with Rattle Magazine. Welcome to your critique of the week. It's Friday, November 22nd. Thanks so much for joining me. Sorry I was a bit late. We had a development meeting going on over Zoom and had to go right at the end of what usually takes a half an hour. We're redesigning the Rattle website, actually. And it took a little bit more time than I thought, so I had to jump right over to the Zoom, and stuff takes like 4 minutes, obviously, to set up. So here I am, 4 minutes late, but I'm so glad you are all here. Let's see who we've got. Patty Arbor is here. She was the first one in. We got Steve Harrell, Dr. Q's here, Habit Malik, Dee Coleman, Morgan Feeney, Tara Meslick McMahon, Rebecca Kate, Jamie Thomas, Rose Leonard, Jamal Udin, Sharon Ferrante is here, Shauna Gammon, CLAS, Lisa Seidenberg, Nancy Sabanik. Yeah, let's see. Mary Lisa's here. Hey, Mary Lisa. Clayton Clark is here. Nancy Tunnell, Jerry Stephenson. Yeah, good to see you all over on Cindy Putnam Guntherman over on Facebook, and Susan Nezel Reardon. Good to see you too. All right, so I do have to pull up the poems we're working on today. Today we're going to do 2 poems each by 2 familiar faces. And those familiar faces are 2 different types of familiar faces. Tina Denetclaw, who you know from the Prompt Lines, always contributes. Always good to see her. She's got 2 poems for us. And we also have 2 from Brent Fisk, who's a poet we've published a good number of times in Rattle. I gotta download Brent's poems. Some of my favorite poems are by Brent Fisk that we've published. There's a couple that are really great. And let's see. I'm gonna download and open this. So anyway, as always, the goal of the critique is to give that workshop experience that is so valuable. Letting people know what we actually think about our poems and what works and what doesn't. Leave as many comments as you can in the chat windows, and we'll get to as much as we can. And let's go here. Okay, so as I mentioned, Tina Denetclaw is the first poet. And let's see. All right, so here's Tina's poem, or first of a couple poems by Tina. Right here. Brave people. Yeah. So Tina, and there's a photo at the end too, I noticed as I was pulling this up. So we'll see how this goes. And those who participate all the time in the prompt lines are familiar with Tina's work, so maybe you can give her some suggestions more overarching than normal as well. But here we go. Brave People by Tina Denetclaw. Prologue. I never thought I'd be grateful for bits of wet cat food littering the hem of my nightgown, rich flecks stick on my fingers as I gently pick them among blue flowers or on soft yellow. She eats best on my lap. Between bouts of dozing, she slept best on my lap since she was a kitten. Half face and one foreleg black, and the other half face and matching forelegs splattered with blonde and white as if she were painted by a fashion designer. Torty embers glow in the black of her back, white toes all around. Wayward streak of orange turns her nose a bit crooked in the midst of elegance. Even-tempered companion, my closest friend, 17 years. She and sisters, gifts to our elderly white Persian, adrift in aloneness after his brother's passing, kittens brought him life again. Our wizardly old gentleman cat chatted with me as we walked, he looking up to speak, bending toward him to listen. Designer kitten watched, eyes wide, astonished. She found her voice for me that day and never stopped. Greetings, questions, chatter, scolding, words of love. Her musical trill, cherished. She struggles now to descend from my lap to the floor. I ask her if she needs to pee. Use your pee pad, reminding as she gingerly moves each leg. We are in a tough situation. The emergency vet believes she would not live. But brave people, my response, meaning my husband, myself, our kitty. She rebounded. 2 months ago, our home a hospital, IV pole waiting by floor lamp, hung with clear bags and infusion sets to give fluid between her shoulders, needles and syringes on the piano, meds next to yogurt in the fridge. Every effort a gesture of faith in the collection of potions and wand waving, keeping her alive. She enjoys her food, desires our attention, purrs to my touch. Holding her, she pushes her head up under my chin, as she always has done. Once a robust hug, now thin and striving. She's a strong-willed cat, her own vet says. We will keep going until she can't anymore. And we will keep going with her until she can't anymore. She sits at the door to her hideaway home and looks back to me, open, needed. She walks to her filled water bowl and stops, fresh water needed. She purrs on my shoulder, sweet soul, my familiar, my girl. I'm not ready to say goodbye either. Epilogue, I still can feel T-Pole's bright sweetness. Her vet says that she will never leave me. And we have a photo, too, of this wonderful cat. Oh, the tortoise cat. Really looks like some cats. My mom's old cat. I wonder if Mom's watching right now. Buttons. I think, did we call her Buttons, Mom? I think so. but that's the beautiful cat by Tina Denetclaw. So for this poem, if you notice, I kind of struggled through reading the poem, and it's a lot because of the line breaks, and a lot because it's not. There's some like clipped out articles and things like that, and I think so two pieces of advice, like right off the bat. Is to write like you talk more, like hear the voice in your head of yourself talking to somebody. What we really want in a poem, I mean, there are all kinds of poems, there's different styles and things like that, but we want to hear, it's a mode of storytelling, and we want to hear your story. And so instead of trying to make it pull back and make strange line breaks and sort of heighten tension that way, just tell the story like straight, like you would in speech. And so as Nancy Schell says, the formatting is a bit confusing to me. And the line breaks too make it sort of more difficult to, it's a straightforward kind of story, and the line breaks make it more difficult to read than it should be. So as Hamet Malik says, though, I'm in the scenes, and exactly. So it's a nice story, and there's good descriptions in it. But the fact that we have a prologue and an epilogue here. The prologue at the beginning, the epilogue at the end, that adds sort of a sense of reading, that we're reading a poem instead of that we're entering the story space, And so I don't know why have this this feature in. I don't think it adds. I think it detracts and distracts more than it adds. And so I would just dive in and not do the prologue and epilogue thing. And then the other thing in general, like we have line breaks like after the of. And so it makes it have this like, stilted kind of like off kilter way. It's a little bit jarring not to have a line break be at a natural pause. So usually articles, and is of still an article or is that something else? Whatever it is, the of. I don't know what part of speech it is. I'm terrible at part of speech labeling them, but whatever it is, like goes with wet cat food. Like of wet cat food is like a chunk of language. And so having a break within that chunk makes the poem feel awkward and a little more difficult to read. And so have more natural line breaks, because what you want, it depends on the kind of poem you're writing, but what you want is to have, the voice come through as strongly and as memorably as possible. And I think some of the decisions here shape it into a sort of a poetry kind of shape. Preposition, that's the word I would look at. Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, of's a preposition. But shaping into like a sort of poetic shape is detracting from just the storytelling of it. And so, so right off the bat, we could just like get rid of the prologue, jump right in here. We can pull back this. There's really no reason to indent it. So we can pull this come on, right there. And then, I never thought I'd be grateful for bits of wet cat food. Either pull the wet cat food up, feel how much easier this is to read. I never thought I'd be grateful for bits of wet cat food littering the hem of my nightgown, rich flecks stick on my fingers, and so, but if we have the break there, we trip over that line because you're not really sure what to expect. And so we could pull it there, or we could, put it down with the of here, but the reading is gonna be a lot more smooth. Here we have two ofs in a row, which is a little annoying to some people, but we could do it that way. But you want to have line breaks if you're doing a sort of a poem like this, where the voice is confiding you a story. You want to have it be smooth to read. Like the shape of the poem should help the reader and not make it more difficult to read. And so that's what I'm talking about here. And so for me, I think I would, for this sort of the feel of the poem, I would go for the longer line, probably, and pull up there, and have the lines kind of be like that. and and sort of stick to like that kind of lengthishness as you move down the page. I think that just feels a lot better. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So Rosenart says Tina is so immersed in the process of looking after an old sick kitty that she has told us a lot about the process of caring, but to be a good poem, I think it needs to be stripped down to essentials. Yeah, oh, that's a great. So Dry Amontillado, who's got great comments all the time, says if someone spoke with the lightness and rhythm of a cat's footsteps, what line lengths and line breaks would they use? That's a great way to think about it. You want to be like, like stepping over. Like for some reason, I was thinking of like, sometimes your kids have like the Legos scattered across the room, and you're like sort of tiptoeing around, making sure you don't step on one of them. Like that's kind of the feel you want. You want the line breaks to be as unobtrusive as possible for the most part. And a poem like this especially. There's other kinds of poems where we might have more tension in the lines, but this is mostly a voice telling a story, and we want that to be as smooth as possible. So I like that metaphor of the cat step. That's perfect. Yeah. Okay, so let's look a little more deeper. Brave People. And it's an interesting title to it. It sort of guides you in the right direction for the poem. And it also, when the brave people come up later, you're kind of like, oh, yeah, that I remember that from the title. So it has that little bit of a thing going for it, which is nice. Anyway, I never thought I'd be grateful for bits of wet cat food littering the hem of my nightgown. Rich flecks stick on my fingers as I gently pick them among blue flowers on soft yellow. And so, yeah, so... somebody said too, Morgan Feeney says, the first stanza confused me a bit. It took a while to realize the nightgown has a blue flower and yellow pattern. Maybe it's just me. No, I think that's true. And Nancy Tennell, suggests too, blue flowers on soft yellow flannel maybe, or something like that, which would be a nice addition. Yeah. I sort of got, that was the hem of the nightgown, so I'm imagining the hem of the nightgown, but it would be nice to call back and tie it all together a little more strongly. So I think that I like that. She eats best on my lap between bouts of dozing. She slept best on my lap since she was a kitten. I'm not sure. This is one of those things where repeating doesn't add, and so, tighten it up with a there. She slept best there since I was a kitten. Or she was a kitten. Her face in one foreleg black, the other half face. And again, here the and chunks just sonically with what comes next. So put the and down there so we don't trip over it. And matching forelegs splattered with blonde and white as if she were painted by a fashion designer. Torty embers glow in the black of her back, white toes all around. So I really love this description. And imagining the flex too on the fingers, those are nice descriptions there. They really pull us into the poem. That's what somebody said earlier. We're in the scene, and I think those descriptions are what make us feel in with the scene. Yeah, and Rosenart said too, I quite like the way the opening doesn't go straight to the actual cat getting their slant. Yeah, too, we're building this scene with these nice descriptions. And so once we smooth out the voice, then we end up, really entering the poem nicely. So torty embers glow in the black of her back, white toes all around. Wayward streak of orange turns her nose a bit crooked in the midst of elegance. Yeah, so nice descriptions. And I think that's enough, maybe. It painted the picture, but the whole point of the poem isn't really the picture. We want to, the picture is like creating a space, and then we can enter and sort of feel something or learn something from. That's really how poems operate. So you create this space with images, and you connect with images, and then that's like the conduit for the feeling. And so I think that's enough description. We don't really need more. And I think we shift mostly at this point. So even-tempered companion, my closest friend for 17 years. I'm not sure. I think even-tempered companion and my closest friend, I would probably just go with a 1. I don't think you need both. I think that's sort of good enough. We get just that. For 17 years, I should say. She and sister, gifts to our elderly. And so this is where we get out of the voice of us just speaking, though. I mean, even though there's no punctuation throughout, it's a natural use of articles and prepositions, now that I remember that word, thank you. And so, and then we get to this clipped sort of section where we're listing things and it doesn't feel as natural. So my closest friend for 17 years, she and sister, gifts to our elderly white Persian adrift in aloneness after his brother's passing, kittens brought him life again. Do you see how that feels different? Like, it's harder to read. It doesn't have the subject and the speaker, the sense of the speaker being there. Like, that's not a way, here we're talking, I never thought I'd be grateful for bits of wet cat food. That's such a natural thing to say, and so the music of that comes out naturally. And that's something that you would tell to somebody. Like, if we're sitting, on your porch drinking tea, listening to this story, we'd hear a sentence like that. We would not hear, she and sister gifts to our elderly white Persian adrift in aloneness after his brother's passing. So, that's not a way you would talk. So we have to get into the mode of somebody actually speaking this to somebody. And that's another way we can really connect. Did we say the name of the cat? I can't remember. But we could say the name here maybe, or just, she and her sister were gifts to our elderly white Persian. Before, and to sort of tell like a story. Before them, he was adrift in aloneness, with actual sentences, like clipping that out, just, it makes it stilted and difficult to read. But I like the details, though. I like hearing the story of the cats and how they were, one cat being adrift in loneliness is an interesting thing. After his brother's passing, kittens brought him back to life again. Our wizardly old gentleman cat chatted with me as we walked. He looking up to speak, I bending toward him to listen. Designer kitten watched, eyes wide, astonished. She found her voice for me that day. And we get a little bit lost, too, in the who's she. Because we don't have natural speech with the subjects and the articles and the pronouns, you get a little bit more lost with who's doing what to where. Morgan Feeney's saying, I think the problem is at least partially passive voice. Who gave the gifts? Yeah, exactly. Who gave the gifts? We lose agency and immediacy with the passive voice. Yeah, exactly. Like, it's the passive voice and it's the incomplete sentences. So there's sentence fragments that are told passively, and then we just lose connection. Imagine you're actually telling a story to me. Imagine, like, pick a person who you actually want to be telling the story to. I mean, say you're telling a story to Hamet Malik, and you're sitting in your kitchen table telling the story about the cat. You can imagine that actually as you're writing it, and write the things that you would say. And then it feels like the natural music of speech comes out that way. So anyway, let's continue. And I think there's maybe like too much backstory here too, as Rose Lennard's pointing out here. Okay. So setting up the scene with the cat so we can see it, and then telling more of the story, and using your voice the whole time. Anyway, our wizardly old gentleman cat chatted with me as we walked. He looked up to speak, bending toward him to listen. Designer kitten watched, eyes wide, astonished. She found her voice for me that day and never stopped. Greetings, questions, chatter, scolding words of love, her musical trill cherished. She struggles now to descend from my lap to the floor. I ask her if she needs to pee. Use your pee pad, reminding as she gingerly moves each leg. We're in a tough situation. The emergency vet believed she would not live. We're brave people, my response, meaning my husband, myself, and our kitty. I like tying that together. That's why I like the title, because it, saying that we're all brave people, including the cat, it like speaks a lot. I think that's a really nice part of the poem. It's nice to highlight. She rebounded 2 months ago. Our home, a hospital IV pole waiting by the floor lamp, hung with clear bags and infusion sets to give fluids between her shoulders, needles and syringes on the piano, meds next to yogurt in the fridge. So Jamie Thomas, and I think this is really, it's just the main thing. And Jamie Thomas says, the advice I got here to pick a person to tell the story to has improved my writing more than maybe anything else. And yeah, that's really the thing. There's different kinds of poems, but most poems, the majority of them, are this mode of sort of telling us a story. It's telling strangers a story in an intimate way. And so if you pick a person that you want to be telling the story to, a lot of things will be coming naturally. Morgan Feeney says, the whole list of all the things the cat says just isn't as vivid or distinct as the image of asking the cat if she needs to pee, the pee pad. I think trying to include everything in the list is too much. Yeah, and so it's cutting back too. The poem could be about a page. Anyway, let's read the end and then I'll look at some more. comments. She enjoys her food, desires, every effort, a gesture of faith, and the collection of potions and wand waving keeping her alive. So see the details. One thing I wanted to point out too, the needles and syringes on the piano, meds next to the yogurt in the fridge. Those are really great details. I love those. And they work so much better, even though they're saying the same thing, as every gesture of faith in the collection of potions and wand waving keeping her alive. Like, the specificity of that's really nice. So, if you were telling this to a story, if Hemet was sitting on your kitchen, you would say something like imagine the needles and syringes on the piano, meds and the yogurt in the fridge, You'd be like gesturing and showing those things, but you wouldn't have the next sentence here, where you're summarizing what that meant, because you're connecting and you know what things mean. You know what I mean? So pulling back on those things that aren't as evocative and interesting, and deleting those and keeping the stuff that's really strong while staying in that active, direct voice, is the key here. Where we go. She enjoys her food, desires our attention, purrs to my touch. Holding her, she pushes her head up under my chin, as she always has done. Once a robust hug, now thin and striving. She's a strong-willed cat, her own vet says. I was confused about her own vet, too. Why would there be a different... Did I miss a detail? I'm not sure. She will keep going until she can't anymore, and we will keep going with her until she can't anymore. She sits at the door to her hideaway room and looks back to me, open, needed. She walks to her filled water bowl, and stops, fresh water needed. Again, I think the needed... Anytime we get poety and not storytelling, I think, and repeating that is just sort of forcing it too hard. She purrs on my shoulder, sweet soul, my familiar, my girl. I'm not ready to say goodbye either. Epilogue. I still can feel T-Pole's bright sweetness. Her vet says that she will never leave me. And that's a sweet ending, too. Yeah. Oh, that's right. Morgan Freeney says there was an emergency vet earlier. So it was an emergency vet. That's one of those things, one of those details that just throws us off and gets confusing. It's just make it one vet. It doesn't need to be accurate for the emergency vet. Just take her to the vet. And even if it was two different vets, the story is better told if there's only one vet, because then we don't get confused like that. Okay. Anyway. Yeah. So that's the thing here. Yeah, there's her name, as Nancy Tell says, T-Pole. Yeah, Rose Larn says the description of her pushing her head up under Tina's chin is very direct, and we can relate to that. Lovely. Yeah, I agree too. Yeah, and we delete the prologue, delete this epilogue. Don't remind us. We want to be lost in the space of your storytelling. We don't want to be reminded that we're reading a poem. And so there's no need to epilogue that. Let me look over on Facebook for what people are saying there. Yeah, Cindy Putnam Gunderman says you don't need all the details of care. Maybe try to shorten. All the feeling would still be there. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and Cindy says too, it's such a touching story. Yeah. And so that's the thing. So, yeah, and folks back were saying that there's sort of two poems. There's two poems here. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think it's just, it repeats itself a little too much so that it feels like some of the sections are too long. I think we have description of the cat, and imagine, we were talking about imagining, Hemet being there in your kitchen, but imagine the cat's actually there, and you're telling this whole story of how, she's still fighting, she's still brave, while you're rubbing her chin, and that can be sort of the frame of it, and then telling the backstory. And I think all the stuff implies it's one poem, and talking, I think the heart too. I think you identified it by giving it that title, that that brave people is the heart, and getting through this is really the key to the poem too, and to make it more about just the cat, So yeah, okay. Let's see, yeah. Let's go to the next poem then. And there's the cat once again. Caretakers Unseen. And so the reason why that we asked for 2 poems is you can see if, if they're just one-off things we're talking about, or if there's a pattern that we need to correct and adjust to get better as poets, So we'll look for the same line break issues. We'll look for the same, storytelling, and we'll see if that applies to this poem, or was that just how that poem happened to be? We're kind of curious about that too. So how does this poem work compared to the other one is what we're really looking at here too. And this is Caretakers Unseen. Again, the poet is Tina Denetclaw. You've seen Tina, of course, on the prompt lines all the time, so it's fun to have her here. Caretakers Unseen. Our very first house, caretakers of drafts, heat, creaking pipes, floors and doors, yard full of trees, 2 apple, vintage, red and gold, 3 cherry, 3 sweet, tart, and yellow, 2 pear, all heavy with fruit in summer, bush buzzing, our very own bees, caretakers too unseen, faithful to our trees and clean, yellow jacket sting can take my life, buzzing bush silenced, our bees found entry through open flue to die, defeated in our windows, our pear tree succumb to fire blight, our bush is silent still. And so again, I think you can see the difficulty reading those clipped sentences that make it sort of like it's like a struggle. It's like trying to climb and find handhold as you move through the poems. And so, so again, it's more write like you talk, actually be telling a story. I think that still applies, and have the line breaks help with the reading and not be getting in the way and making us more aware that we're moving through a poem and not being told a story through the music of speech. So I like a lot of the details here again, though. So it's sort of got the same strengths and the same weaknesses as the last poem, Caretakers Unseen. It's got an emotional element to it. It's got good details and descriptions, and we have a sense of movement somewhere. And so all those things are working well. It's sort of a matter of smoothing out and having us forget that we're reading a poem. It's that suspension of disbelief, like you're reading a novel and suddenly you're in the world of James Joyce or whatever. That's the effect you want with a poem too. And you have this like little tiny container to get into that effect where you forget that you're reading a poem and you enter someone else's like body and space and life and shoes and breath. And that's really the power of a poem. We don't want to think about the fact that we're doing that, or you don't enter the poem. So, okay. Caretakers Unseen, our very first house, caretakers of drafts, heat. So again, our very first house, or in our very first house, we were caretakers of drafts. And that makes for a very nice line. The heat creaked from pipes, floors, and doors. The yard was full of trees. I think once you sort of establish that, you could get away, I think, with 2 apple, having a list there. But having that, in our very first house, or in our first house, we were caretakers of drafts. Heat creaked from pipes. I'm just saying it again because it just feels so much better than having that clipped like we want to hear the story. 2 apples, vintage, red and gold, 3 cherry, sweet, tart, and yellow. 2 pear. All heavy with heavy with fruit in summer. And one of these tricks you can have is if you pull up heavy with summer fruit, that makes the whole thing feel more condensed and makes the poem feel less wordy. Like there's an effort in these poems to be sort of direct and less wordy, but it's doing that by stripping out, taking out verbs and taking out articles and taking out prepositions, and pronouns. It's taking out those helper verbs. Going back to, which I haven't read in a while, I don't know if I should read again, but that Rina Espaillat poem about taking out all the articles. We don't want to do that. We want it to feel natural even within this container that we're doing. So, and so one of the things you can do is sort of condense all heavy with fruit in summer to all heavy with summer fruit, and that comes through mentally much quicker. And so if we want that condension, which is what you're going for here, condensing in that way versus adding on to lists doesn't actually condense, if that makes sense. Okay, bush buzzing, our very own bees, caretakers too, And so let me just actually do this. Feel how better, instead of just saying it over and over again. Let's just do this. Let's see. In our very first house, we were caretakers of drafts, heat creaking from pipes, Oops, sorry, it's like, there we go. Heat creaking from pipes. Doors. I don't know why either not including punctuation, but so I would even just include the punctuation. Like, it doesn't really trip you up. It just helps us read. And then instead of yard full of trees, the yard was full of trees. And you could have a colon there, 2 apple, vintage red and gold, 3 cherry, sweet tart. I don't know if since you're listing, I would just leave the yellow. 2 pear, and why not describe the pear a little? You set up this sort of parallel thing where we're going to describe things. Why not describe it all the way? All heavy with summer fruit, and then the bush was See, I'm not good with this keyboard as I am with the other keyboard. The bush was buzzing too. Our very own bees. Maybe not the 2, because we have the 2 later. The bush was buzzing. Our very own bees. And maybe a comment here, Our very own bees were caretakers too. So we get whole sentences. We're caretakers too, unseen, faithful to our trees, and clean. That's very nice. And period. Why not? But a yellow jacket sting can take my life. And once you do this, it just, it's stripping out the things where we're trying to be, we're trying to sort of push poetry on people instead of just let it land. Yeah. Let's see. So Bethany Armour says was is a weak verb, though. I would try to come up with a stronger verb. Sometimes it depends where you're going and what you're doing. A lot of times going for a stronger verb. So it's the same thing with in dialogue. It comes up all the time. It's actually much stronger in a lot of cases. There's this whole like alternate words to said you can use. But the fact is, like, say and says slip to the background and sort of don't even exist, and yet they help, because there's two levels of comprehension. You got to remember, we're 2 brains, and those 2 brains have multiple sections. We're all comprehending things at different times, and so even though you don't, sometimes you want the unobtrusive verb that doesn't like take your attention away, and yet it fulfills the expectations of the Broca's area in the brain that handles all those function words and makes the sentences feel natural and feel musical. And so, the bush was buzzing. That's a weak verb, but it's not a place where you want. You could say the bush buzzed with bees, and that might be better, and that's true. That it could be better in this case too. But it's not necessarily, I think it gives the wrong impression that you always want to have stronger verbs. In the same way, you could say like, there's all these alternative ways. Like he shouted, he ejaculated, people say, and they start adding these verbs for speech because they don't want to say says every time. But it's actually way better to just say said every time in a lot of cases, and it varies depending on what you're doing. But just having weak verbs isn't necessarily a bad thing, which is a point I want to kind of stress. And Dr. Q agrees, though, was buzzing lessens the buzzing. It might be. You could say the bush was buzzing with bees, too, or the bush buzzed with bees. But see, the problem with that is like it gets too alliterative to me. Yeah. So anyway, let's keep going through. But see how I'm just trying to go through and adding the actual language. It doesn't make the poem longer. It makes the poem more smooth. Our bees found entry through, unopened flue, to die, defeated, in our windows. Our pear tree succumbed. And yeah, as Dick says, I like this too. Dick Westheimer says, succumbed is a great opportunity for metaphor. The word itself is cliche. Yeah. 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 Rose Leonard says, the bush vibrated with bees. Yeah, I mean, you have to sort of feel around and feel, it's sort of like a next level choice whether to push. You see a lot of times though people trying to push verbs too hard. Yeah, Tom Barlow says avoid Tom Swifties. Yeah, exactly. Mark Goodyear says I like the subtle ecological message in this poem with the loss of the bees leading to the bareness of dead trees and such. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, our bees found entry through an open flue. And I'm not sure, to die, defeated in our windows. I like that. You can really see that, the open flue, then dying there. Our pear trees succumbed to fire blight. And again, this is one of those where, don't hang that preposition over the edge because it makes it a little clunky to read. To fire blight, our bush silent still. And I feel like I feel like there's a nod toward what Mark Grenier was saying, the subtle ecological message in the poem. But I feel like the poem sort of got. So we were talking just yesterday. I should mention how great the poetry space was yesterday. Dick Westheimer's there on the line as part of the squad, but that's Katie Dozier's show. You can find it on the poetry space. Just go in iTunes and stuff. But one of the things that we were talking about, the braids with David Kirby, the sort of the inventor maybe of braids. But one of the things he said was that. Now I lost my train of thought. What was I going to bring up from that? So there was some of the discussion was going on about how poets have a tendency to, I think it was Katie actually who said this, but so David was talking about how using that braid form pushes you farther than you expected to go. And Katie pointed out that this is a big problem with poems all the time, because once we get to a thing that feels like, oh, we got somewhere with this poem, we're sort of happy with that, and we end there. And so often, that's just not enough. It's the difference between like an okay poem and like a great poem sometimes, is that you push past into something new still. In this, this poem feels like it got to something, which is that ecological thing, that sense of the blight coming and then the bushes growing silent and all that wrapped up. It didn't like unpack that and push it farther, Morgan Fee says, I'm left wondering if the author moves on to another house when the bush goes silent and what happened there. But I kind of like not being told for sure. That's the kind of thing. Like, it feels like there's more there to mine. Like, we got to a place where there was something worth mining. And I think it felt like that was a satisfying stop. But then there's more there that we could explore further. Like, what happens next? We did have a prompt a while ago. Yeah, Nancy Sabanek puts it this way. The ending feels like it is leaning to a deeper meaning. And and there's a tendency when we're writing poems to think, oh, we got toward a deeper meaning. Good, now it's over. Instead of pushing past and finding more. So Petty Arbor says, ending has good energy, but then I need more. Mm-hmm. And Dick says, I followed Katie's advice for my PR poem this week. It was like magic, and I found so much more than I expected. Yeah, exactly. And I always think about it like, and this is why I can't write fiction, because I always, as a poet, I like taking the first great ending, And so I'm writing, if I'm trying to write a short story, so often I'll be writing and it'll occur to me like, what would be a great last line? And this would sort of wrap it up and be interesting, And I feel like it's like you're driving down on a road trip and you like take the first exit ramp, and you could drive how many more exits down the road, but you're just like looking for the first exit of the freeway. And so don't look for the first exit from the freeway, inherently. I mean, sometimes maybe it works, but see what happens if you keep going down the road. And I think there's more down this road. A couple small notes. Somebody pointed out that, and I do believe this is the case, that yellow jackets and bees are different. And yeah, I do believe, because it mentions yellow jackets before. So that's a detail, right? Did it say that somewhere? Yeah. But a yellow jacket sting can take my life. Yellow jackets are a kind of wasp, right? Or they're different than... They don't operate the same way as bees do pollinating, as I understand it, right? That sounds familiar. And I'll take whoever said that's word for it. Okay. Yeah, as Perry ever said, it does feel like a relief to find the first ending. And yeah, I think that's just a problem we face. And I think that's what it has. This poem found a first ending, but like, what else could we say about it? What more could be in there? Like, you got us interested in the story, but like, what did you do when the bush went silent? What more can we dig into there? Could we take it to like a braid, take it to a completely different place? We're confused as though wasps are still important pollinators, I believe. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So they're just technically not bees, but they could still do the function of bees. Okay. Well, that makes sense to me. Thanks for the education. Dick Ryan says, or exit, then go to a shabby diner and order a cup of coffee and strike up a conversation with a person sitting next to you at the counter. Yeah. But that's true. I mean, like where could you go? Like, a poem you should be playing with it too, right? And so when you get to a point like this, like, where else can I go? Where can I surprise myself by going? And, and when, the bush is silent, and then where else did I go? Like, completely different. And then how can you tie that back together? And that can be a lot of the fun. So it just feels like it's waiting to go somewhere new. All right, well, let's move on. So we've talked a lot. Thanks so much for sharing these, Tina. It's always great to have you here, and we appreciate that. We're getting a window into Dick's life. All right, so let's take a look at the other poem now. And actually, let me check first, make sure there weren't any special questions from Tina, because I forgot to check. Because if you came in late, I came in late too, because I had a meeting that went late. Just a couple minutes late, but still, it was later than I wanted. So did Tina have any questions specifically? Okay, no, she did not. Brent Fisk does, though, and Brent Fisk is the next poet. So let's take a look at Brent's poems. And they are here. And of course, Brent, let me remind myself and you. It's been a while since we published Brent, but we published some really great poems. Let's see. We have, Making a Living and Present. Drug Facts. That was a really good one from our humor issue. So a lot of wordplay in Brent's poems. The present one and the drug facts one was funny. So go back and look at Brent's poems from past issues of Rattle if you would like. But let's look at what Brent's been doing lately and see what we can do about it. Okay, here we go. And Brent did have specific questions, like I said. Brent said, what tools do you use to get distance from your work and make the necessary revisions in order to prepare your work for submission? Interesting. So here's Brent Fisk, and asking about tools, too. Oops, wrong one. Right here. And then we want to go here. Okay. Brent Fisk. Almanac. And... Okay. Almanac. All the woolly bare caterpillars I see are pure black, not a band of brown on any of them. Sure sign, my grandmother would say, of a harsh winter. I am reminded there are different types of cold. My grandfather burning sleep in the back room like an old wood stove, while my brother and I curled next to my grandmother on the sofa bed under tattered quilts that smelled of mothballs and cigarette smoke. That whole house could fit inside the garage I own today and still leave space for the boxes of old photographs we have no room for on our walls. My grandmother said the persimmon seeds were full of knives and spoons, and she tested the thick skins of apples and onions between her thumb and forefinger. She honed the axe blade and chopped hickory we piled against the chain-link fence until it bent the posts. My grandfather, when he woke, drank 3 cups of coffee before he opened his eyes, then chased a smear of yolk around the plate, sopping up bacon grease with his white bread. His toenails poked holes in his socks. The windows blazed with the brightness of frost, and my grandmother asked how he could stand to sit there in his underwear when we could see our breath. We had slept in his undershirts, played quiet behind the couch, blankets pulled around us like cowls. He spoke of the old ways, too, how they measured in spans, not in hands, in pecks and bushels, fathoms and leagues. He thought our hair was too long if he could grasp a handful and pull it so our heads bent back as if he meant to cut our throats. What is the length of a safe distance? How do we measure our love? I thought that man was mean enough to drive off monsters, but then the stubborn mule of his heart kicked him in the chest. I cried more for him than any dead relative before or since. How do I judge the weight of that grief? For a while, how I felt it take hold of me, bend my neck back, measure the world in ways we no longer have names for. And then, as he had done, it let me go. Yeah, so that's a very nice poem, Almanac. You can feel, like we were talking about with Tina's poems earlier, you can feel it's a great example of having the poem feel like natural speech, but adding poetic elements in on top of that. Instead of trying to strip it down so it feels like something different than regular speech, this has all of the articles, all the verbs. It feels very natural. You can imagine somebody telling this to somebody. This is just good storytelling, And so that's something to kind of strive for in the first place. And there's great details too. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so Semantic says such interesting details that bring the people to life. I love this. Fabulous end. Yeah. Deb T points out the return of the head bent back. Yeah, some great unexpected images, says Rhodes Leonard. Yeah. Yeah, and Amy Dower Solorzano says full of interesting and memorable details, and that's completely true too. And so what can we add to this poem, and what can we this is what I would say is a highly publishable poem. I'm sure it will be published if it hasn't already by the point. This is still a submission from a few months ago. So what can we add to make the poem better? And the question Brent had was, what tools do you use to get distance from your work and make necessary revisions in order to prepare your work for submission? And I'd say, this is the critique of the week is a great thing. Waiting a little bit, reading the poems out loud. One thing I like to do is read the poem in somebody else's voice, at least in my head, like in an accent, that's not really natural to the poem even. And you can sort of feel how the poem is smoothed out that way. Reading the poem aloud yourself to see where you trip up, having somebody else read the poem to you. Like those all things are very helpful. But Brent knows that, so I don't know why. Brent's already there. Let's read it again, and we'll talk in more detail about what maybe we could change. One of the things I did feel as I was moving through the poem, the details are great. I was really on board with the voice. I felt like it was getting like, is this going somewhere? Was a question that occurred to me, and it ended up going somewhere. But maybe it took a little too long getting there. Like that sense of like, okay, this is good, but where is it going? You can only hold on to that feeling for so long before you sort of start daydreaming. Even when the details are great and the voice is great too. So pay attention to that. That's the only thing. My first is that maybe we could tighten stuff up a little bit. But let's read more closely. Almanac, and I love the title too. The title it says a lot more. There's a cut between the title, like there is in a haiku. There's a cut between the title and the content of the poem. The almanac is not something that appears in the poem, but it's something that adds both the sense of the old-fashioned way of life that the almanac is memorable about, and also life itself being a kind of almanac too, and that's sort of tied together into this poem. So, almanac. All the woolly, bare caterpillars I see are pure black, not a band of brown on any of them, sure sign, my grandmother would say, of a harsh winter. So that's one of those great details that comes from the old Farmer's Almanac, So it's a nice setup there, and then that takes me there, like Proust Madeline's. That takes me back. I'm reminded there are different types of cold, and that's a great transitional sentence too. So really, off the bat, those first 4 lines I couldn't improve. My grandfather burning sleep in the back room like an old wood stove, and that's a great way to say it. While my brother and I curled next to my grandmother on the sofa under tattered quilts that smelled of mothballs and cigarette smoke. So again, great details. The whole house could fit inside the garage I own today, and still leave space for the boxes of old photographs we have no room for on the walls. So this is the first detail. I felt this went on a little too long in this detail. Like the space for the boxes of old photographs we have no room for on the walls. I think it's a really interesting concept, but it's a little hard to wrap your mind around what it's saying at first, so it loses some of the flow of the poem there, trying to piece it together. And I think it's that's some instance where, to me, I think the poet's sort of too pleased with yourself. This is another thing that happens. We talked already about that first ending and taking the first exit. Another thing happens is that you come up with a line, and it's a great line on its own, and you don't want to lose it. But still, does it really, add to this? Does it service the poem? Does it take the poem somewhere else? And I don't know if that line does. And so that's something I'd consider playing with, or shortening, maybe, if you can say it in a little more condensed way. But maybe leave. I mean, you sort of, these things you want to play with a little bit. My grandmother said the persimmon seeds were full of knives and spoons, and she tested the thick skins of apples and onions between her thumb and forefinger. She has great details. I think what comes to life the most in this poem is the descriptions of the grandparents. I think they're just amazing, and they really feel like characters you can touch. She honed the axe blade and chopped hickory we piled against the chain link fence until it bent the posts. My grandfather, when he woke, drank 3 cups of coffee before he opened his eyes, then chased a smear of yolk around the plate. And again, we get nice, we haven't mentioned really, but we get nice internal rhymes too that are really subtle. Like the woken yolk is the strongest, but we had a bunch of them earlier in the poem too. And that's a great, focusing in on that detail. A more novice poet, would say something about, 3 cups of coffee before open eyes and chased eggs around his plate, but it's the smear of yolk, like zooming in that much to the smear of yolk itself and not just the eggs, It's not he chased scrambled eggs around the plate. It's a smear of yolk. That's really cool. Sopping up bacon grease with his white bread. And here, I think maybe I misread beard for bread. And I think because there were so many great lines, I almost anticipated a surprise here. And so I expected something a little unusual. And so I leaped to bread or beard, because I think that actually makes it more interesting than just with a white bread. And I think maybe that's another detail, kind of that's not as vivid and doesn't add as much as these. So I think you could cut back this and maybe cut out this. And then, and I think that poem gets a little more tight and condensed. His toenails poked holes in his socks. I think that line too. I don't know why. Yeah, I think you could delete both these lines and just end here. I don't think it adds anything to the poem. Windows blazed with the brightness of frost, and my grandmother asked how he could stand to sit there in his underwear when we could see our breath. He had slept in his undershirts, played quiet we had slept in his undershirts, played quiet behind the couch, blankets pulled around us like cowls. Again, it's just great descriptions of what's going on. He spoke of the old ways, too, how they measured in spans and hands and pecks and bushels, fathoms and leagues. So great details again. It's sort of hinting back at the Farmer's Almanac, that old way of life, too. He thought our hair was too long if he could grasp a handful and pull it so our heads bent back as if he meant to cut our throats. Again, a really great detail. And a little bit of darkness there, too. What is the length of a safe distance? How do we measure our love? I thought that man was mean enough to drive off monsters, but then the stubborn mule of his heart kicked him in the chest. And so I think that's a great way to say that he died without saying he died. I think it's a way to make that more vivid. I cried more for him than any dead relative before or since. How do I judge the weight of that grief? For a while I felt it take hold of me, bend my neck back, measure the world in ways we no longer have names for. And then, as he had done, it let me go. And I think, to me, the thing that doesn't make this poem... So I love the very end. I love going back. Somebody mentioned, for a while I felt it take hold of me, bend my neck back. I love going back to that image from the stanza before, and then having it be, how a measure of the world, and then letting me go. I think that's great turn at the end. I think the thing that's making the poem not as strong as it could be, even though the execution is great, these lines, how do I judge the weight of grief? And what is the length of a safe distance? How do we measure our love? I think those questions are sort of a little too generic for the poem. I think maybe that they end up being, even though they're questions, and a lot of times questions work in poems, they end up being sort of a telling rather than showing issue, because they aren't, I don't know. And I wonder if the poem would be better just cutting those too. They sort of frame it a little too much, and it weakens the power of it, I think. I think a lot of times you want you want to have, one of the things we talk about sometimes is that 80-20 rule, or the 80% kiss from the movie Hitched, which I don't know why is the only example I know of it. But you want to go 80% and let the reader come back 20%, And I think having those questions, like this is what I'm wondering about right now, is a little too close to that 100% telling the poem. And it's so vivid. You want to let us kind of come to a little bit of the conclusion about what you're thinking about. And I think, and it ends up feeling a little, because they're sort of generic questions, a little artificial too. And I think that's what's holding this poem back slightly, is how to handle that. And it's one of those things, it's a lot easier to talk about like where the line break should be and add things back. And, than it is to say like, it's missing like a little nugget of something. But how you handle that transition to what the poem's really about is what makes the poem like, go from a great poem to a good poem. And I think that's the main issue. Let me see. I've been talking a lot. Yeah, Dr. Q said I would cut those 2 questions. I wonder if you just cut them. If you just cut those like 5 lines I mentioned, maybe that's all the poem needs to do. But it feels like the poem's trying a little too hard to be profound, I guess is another way to put it. Dry Montito points out I like trying to quantify the heaviness of grief and that callback to the old units of measurement. And that's one of the things, maybe if we just left that one question, how do I judge the weight of that grief? And then called back even more strongly, maybe adding more measures, I'm not sure what we could use, but more types of measurement, pulling back to, where was that in the poem? Wherever it was, pulling, like saying, repeating that again, or, new kinds of measurements maybe, and maybe listing some ways you could measure the grief could make it have the same amount of energy that the elements of the poem have. Like, how do we measure the weight of that grief? Is it in spoonfuls of this? One of the poems I was looking at recently was that The Forgotten Dialect of the Heart by Jack Gilbert. And he's got those great lines. It's like, my love, because he's talking about how cuneiform writing were just lists of possessions. And he says, my love is 100 pitchers of honey. The Thuya says, the baskets of Thuya say what my body wants to do to your body. Using those measurements to talk about love. And I think maybe we could do that instead of just having the general question. We could see some details of what those measurements might be, and that might keep the questions in the poem as strong as the rest of the poem. Because I think the problem is that section, it's not bad, but it doesn't live up to how great the rest of the poem is. And so I think that may be the element. I think that may be the thing that makes the poem really come to life. Okay. And we have another poem by Brent. Looking forward to reading that too. Let me see if there's any other questions. I should say too, if anybody has, haven't clicked the like button yet, I should say, make sure you do. There's, almost more than 3 times as many people who are watching as have clicked like so far. So make sure that you do. Okay, so let's read the other poem here from Brent. 3 cigarette butts and a crushed grasshopper. How long is? Let me see how long it is too, so I think I might need to. Yeah, it's a little longer. Let me take another sip of coffee. Okay. 3 cigarette butts and a crushed grasshopper. Each day at work, I walk the road that runs beside the warehouse, a grassy lot vacant to the west. They mow it once a month, just to let the wildflowers know who's boss. I stop where they've dumped a heap of crumbling blacktop, the ground heaving up through blackberry brambles and staghorn sumac, blue stem and thistle to the rail line that hums with distant freight. It's been a strange summer of unexpected deaths, a lunar eclipse, August sundogs low in the sky. Mailboxes knocked akimbo or spun into ditches, eaves sweeping honey, studded with the striped bodies of bees. Hey, those bees are back. I like the finality of this small non-place, how it is penned in by chain link and razor wire, bordered by a rural highway. I love how the rail lines seem to meet but never do. There are only so many directions a person can go here, limited paths by which the world can approach. It's a spot one can leave the body and let the mind become a dust-filthy drifter. I think of my Aunt Martha at the kitchen table, her thin cigarettes and bushy eyebrows, how smoke tendrilled out and disappeared. She told me how hobos had their own secret language, symbols that marked a house safe to approach, which wore windows, traded work for food, let a man wash in the horse trough, and which were eager to show their prowess with shotguns or had dogs that slept stealthily in the shade of a shed. I hear the fish plate switch the rail's direction and know a train is coming. The engine thunders past and the boxcars tremble with bright balloon letters sprayed along the side, Zeppo, Blush, Fen and Dandy, and garish reds and pinks and greens. Some detailed with lines and shading, some just the start of an outline, as if the vandal was snatched away. Today, 3 cigarette butts and a carcass of crushed legs and wings tell me someone has lingered before me, had time to kill a grasshopper who got too close, didn't sense the danger, as most of us do not. I look for other signs the person may have left, seeing nothing but tire shreds, a stunted field of chicory stubble, a glimmering galaxy of shattered glass. Even now, a small train of ants takes sustenance, carved death into digestible pieces, the locomotive of it reduced by distance, by scale, by scope, so even the ground forgets trembling as it passed. Yeah, so again, fantastic images, great rhythm, great voice, great title. And I think to me, this one, I think that the heart of the poem so much was this wonderful, so many times the real heart of the poem, like the emotional lodestone, is a really simple sentence. And I think there are so many directions a person can go here. That was just, especially when you have these long, beautiful sentences that are sort of have a lot layered on and are moving through a lot of like conjunctions and contractions. And then you have a sort of simple one. There are only so many directions a person can go here. I think that's really wonderful. And I feel like the poem is sort of leading up to that. And then almost like the dog that chased the car, and once you didn't know what to do with it once it caught it. I feel like this one, it sort of went off the track a little bit, no pun intended, when it got to like the heart of it. Even though I love a lot of the content, I think that it's missing like what ties it together maybe. Yeah, and I think that's why Jamie Thomas says this is one where I can tell it's well written, but I'm having a hard time connecting with it. And I think that's why it didn't really, it sort of like skipped off the heart of the poem and sort of went and continued, but didn't find its way back, But yeah, as Dr. Q said, Brent has concrete images. And that's the thing. I mean, you can see how much the poem comes to life when you have that. Like that's something we talk about here every week, how important it is to have that specificity, those concrete details that really bring things to life. And Lisa Seidenberg says got nostalgic details, good nostalgic details, had a strong start, but then it got lost in the middle, or a little in the second half. And yeah, I think that's it. So let's kind of read through again and pay attention to that. We're past the hour, but these are fun poems to go over. So, and I really appreciate you sharing these, Brent, because they're fun to do. Okay, each day at work, I walk the road that runs beside the warehouse, a grassy lot vacant to the west. So each day we're after work, I'm walking that road, so we're setting the scene, and then we're like building the scene into this really vivid, imaginative space that we get to enter. They mow it once a month just to let the wildflowers know who's boss. So I like let the wildflowers know who's boss. That line, though, feels a little bit off, and I wonder maybe if the reason... It just feels like it wasn't, not off is the right word. It feels like it wasn't continued throughout the poem. There's sort of like a playfulness and like a humor in there that doesn't continue. And I wonder if maybe we want more of that. We kind of lose it. Yeah, so Morgan Feeney is saying, I kind of want to see this as a sestina or something. Some sort of form might help us connect better. And that's a good idea. I've never seen Brent, that drug facts poem is an interesting form. It's a poem written in actual drug facts, which is really fun if you want to go back to Riddle number 33 for that one. Yeah, Rosenart says, I love the insight into the writer that this is a person who will notice a grasshopper carcass and realize someone has deliberately crushed it. Yeah, and that's a good point, too. So anyway, they mow it once a month just to let the wildflowers know who's boss. I stop where they've dumped a heap of crumbling blacktop, the ground heaving up through blackberry brambles and staghorn sumac. See that great staghorn sumac? Like, what details? I don't even know what staghorn sumac really is. but I just love hearing it and saying it. And you kind of know in context what ish it is, and you can imagine blue stem and thistle to the rail line that hums with distant freight, And there's a thing that the hums with distant freight's a nice use of a verb. We talked about having stronger verbs earlier, and sometimes you don't want them necessarily, but that's a smoothly done, it's humming. It's been a strange summer of unexpected deaths, a lunar eclipse, August sundogs low in the sky. I think, the strange summer is another thing that doesn't really pick up. Like, there are a lot of sort of threads that are dropped in this poem, and it doesn't feel set in a specific summer for most of the poem. And I wonder if maybe, like, there are a lot of little false directions to go, And so maybe cut that too, and sort of enter this another way. Mailboxes knocked akimbo or spun into ditches. Great description details here. Eaves seeping honey, studded with the striped bodies of bees. I guess what it is about the summer is that it feels like we're talking about this timeless, as we say later, there's so many directions a person can go here. And that's like always been the case, or for a long time. There's a stagnant sense to the whole scene. And so fixing it in the one summer feels a little off to me. But anyway, I like the finality of this small non-place. How it is penned in by chain link and razor wire, bordered by a rural highway. I love how the rail lines seem to meet but never do. So great noticing of that. I like the way that's said. There are only so many directions a person can go here. Limited paths by which the world can approach. It's a spot one can leave with the body and let the mind become a dusty, filthy drifter. I think maybe I'd cut off the I think of. I do like the moving to the ant, though. I think of my Aunt Martha at the kitchen table, her thin cigarettes and bushy eyebrows, how smoke tendrilled out and disappeared. She told me how hobos had their own secret language, symbols that marked a house safe to approach, which wore windows traded work for food, let a man wash in the horse trough, and which were eager to show their prowess with shotguns, or had dogs that slept stealthy in the shade of a shed. I think I would probably, drop that sentence because it just repeats the sort of sentiment of this and doesn't really add anything. I hear the fish plate switch the rail's direction and know a train is coming. So it's a nice transition. And so I sort of like it here. And this is where I sort of lose, I don't know, it feels like it loses the thread of what it wants to say. But I like it's sort of like it's a perfect shift, and then it doesn't shift to a conclusion that feels like it was inevitable, or like it tied it all up. The engine thunders past, the boxcars tremble with bright balloon letters sprayed along their sides, Zeppo, Blush, Fen, Dandy, and garish reds and pinks and greens. Some detailed with lines and shading, some just the start of an outline, as if the vandal was snatched away. See, I like the details there, once the engine thunders past and the boxcars trembling, but then we go into all this detail. I'm not sure how to connect it to things not sure where they're going to go. There's only so many places you can go. The vandal's there, but I don't know. It just doesn't seem to be relevant enough, I guess. Today, 3 cigarette butts and a carcass of crushed legs and wings tell me someone has lingered before me, had time to kill a grasshopper. And there's nice, playfulness in that time to kill, and you think it's just time to kill the idiom, and then it's time to kill a grasshopper who got too close. Didn't sense the danger, as most of us do. And again, this didn't sense the danger. There's something more connecting that with the, where'd it go? There are so many directions a person can go here. And the danger that's sort of lurking, that's the thing that doesn't feel like it's fully explored. As most of us do not. I look for other signs the person may have left, see nothing but tire shreds, a stunted field of chicory stubble, a glimmering galaxy of shattered glass. So these are great descriptions still. Even now, a small train of ants takes sustenance, carve death into digestible pieces. The locomotive of it reduced by distance, by scale, by scope, so even the ground forgets trembling as it passed. And see, the ground forgets trembling as it passed. It's another one of those really nice lines that just doesn't, it's a nice line on its own, but doesn't connect right with the poem. It doesn't click together. Yeah, Ali Rowland says this, and I think this is a good way to put it. The author's voice sounds very knowing, but then doesn't seem to let the reader into the actual message. I do really like the ants in the train. And I think there's something about the ants knowing where they're going, and they have only so many options too, and there's only so many, there's sort of different jobs ants can have, and then they're either this or that. There's this way that you're stuck into what you are in an ant colony in the same way that you're stuck, in this small town. And there's like something there, but it isn't like pulled together yet. And I think the ground for getting trembling as it passed sounds nice, but doesn't tie that together. And so it just hasn't really found its ending yet. Yeah, as Deb T said, hearing the poem a second time, I feel like the setting is so well rendered, but like it's an evocative stage set, but want more of a story for the stage set. Yeah. Morgan Fee says, the end makes me think of the parable of the ants and the grasshopper, maybe something that could be wrapped up in a title. Would that make the poem stronger? Yeah, I just think that there's, I don't know. I mean, I love the locomotive of it reduced by distance, by scale, by scope. I just think there's another last line. Like, this was the wrong last line. There are a few sort of like wrong turns in the poem that sound great and like are beautiful lines of poetry, and so they were kept. But they weren't the turns that the poem really wanted. And I think it hasn't found those exact things yet. Nancy Sabanek says the poem conveys a sense of alienation in the images. And yeah, I think that's it too. It's sort of already there. And I wonder if maybe this could be a rare case where and maybe both poems kind of in a way do that, where the whole thing, because it's so evocative, like takes you to a place, and maybe it doesn't need the explanation at all. Maybe, I mean, maybe we can be more of an imagist and just building the scene, let that scene linger, and maybe that can be. But I think both things haven't quite found, like they're making these nods toward like more depthful interpretations of things, but then not really hitting them home and not really tying them up in a way that fits right. Yeah. Yeah, Mike Reader says, wonderful language in both these poems. The meat underlying them may need more clarification. And Nancy Sabanek, the unexpected deaths are a clue, but perhaps another specific detail about that would tie it together. Yeah, it's just not quite tying it up at the end. And I think as I was trying to explain, like with the last poem too, it's like there's an attempt at tying it up that was like unsuccessfly tied. And I think there's a way that you could end a poem without tying things and leaving them ambiguous and sort of strange. But because it tries to tie them up together, but then doesn't tie them up in a way that's like tight and like a perfect little knot, it sort of leaves us unsatisfied. And I think that's the problem with both these poems. It's a great way, again, to see why we like to see two poems for these critiques, because we get to see if it's something similar. And I think it is here, where it's like, if you're going to go for that tying it up in a profound way, it's got to hit the nail on the head, or, it's got to be like really precise with it and make it all make sense. Otherwise, like, I think leaving some ambiguity would be better. And so I think you got a choice to go which way. But I think it hasn't like decided which way it can go yet. So that's it. I think that, both poems are just, the writing is just wonderful. And some of the best writing, really, just the details and the ease with which the details flow out through a natural voice. I mean, it's like 99th percentile of poems I ever see. They're just great. I mean, they're better than most poems we publish in those regards. It's just so, obviously you can tell why we published Brent Fisk several times in the past, because he's a great poet. It's just a matter of like having the poems like leave you with something that's really memorable. The writing is just beautiful. Deb T says gorgeous writing, and it just is. I think Malk says needs braiding. yeah, that could be too. Maybe, listen to, go to the Poetry Space on iTunes or Spotify or whatever, and listen to our most recent episode that just released with David Kirby, and how he thinks. I see it's a great point, Hemet. If you listen to that episode with David Kirby, how he approaches and encounters a poem, because like you've got everything going for you. I mean, the language and the detail is just amazing, and it's missing that last little oomph of something in both these cases. And I think like having Kirby's way of braiding different stories together might be the thing that really makes the poetry explode into just amazing stuff. So check that out, and everybody should watch that episode. It was a really great episode with David Kirby. That's Katie Dozier's podcast that I do with her, The Poetry Space. We just released one today. It's every Friday we drop one. So anyway, those are some great poems. Thanks for sharing those, Brent. And there's Almanac and 3 cigarette butts and a crushed grasshopper. And we also looked at 2 poems by Tina Denetclaw. So really fun group of poems today. Really appreciate everybody who did this. It's always my pleasure doing some critique of the week, even if I come in late, straight from another meeting. But it worked really well. So thanks for being here. Let's see. So this week, coming up on the Rattlecast, the guest is going to be Austin Alexis. So I wanted to have some poets from our Tribute to Musicians issue. Austin did one of the best notes, I thought. I really liked what he described, how he described music and poetry as being related. So I wanted to talk more about that. Austin is in one of the biggest and most famous male choirs, I think, if I remember right. So he does a lot of music in his life as well as poetry. His book is Privacy Issues, which was winner of the Naomi Long Magit Poetry Award back in 2014. So we'll talk about that and poetry and music. This should be a fun episode. That's Rattlecast number 270. The prompt for this week was to take the first thing you remember being thankful for, right? I'm going to make sure I phrase it right. Write an ode. That's what I was missing. Write an ode to the first thing you remembered being thankful for. That was your prompt for this week. Write an ode to the first thing you remember being thankful for. That's going to be your prompt. Rattlecast number 270 with Austin Alexis is your guest. Sunday, November 24th, regular time, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Hope to see you there. Hope you have a great weekend in the meantime, and we'll talk to you later. Goodbye.